Chapter 3. In the Earliest Cities. The Story of Harappa. Very often, old buildings have a story to tell. Nearly 150 years ago, when railway lines were being laid down for the first time in Punjab, engineers stumbled upon the site of Harappa in the present day Pakistan. To them, it seemed like a mound that was a rich source of ready made, high quality bricks. So they carried off thousands of bricks from the walls of the old building of the city to build the railway lines. Many buildings were completely destroyed. Then, about 80 years ago, archaeologists found the site and realized that this was one of the oldest cities of the subcontinent, as this was the first city to be discovered. All other sites from where similar buildings and other things were found were described as Harappan. These cities developed about 4,700 years ago. Very often, old buildings are pulled down to make a way for the new construction. Do you think it is important to preserve the old building? What was special about these cities? Many of these cities were divided into two or more parts. Usually, the part of the west was smaller but higher. Archaeologists describe this as a citadel. Generally, the part of the east was larger but lower. This is called as the lower town. Very often, walls of the baked brick were built around each part. The bricks were so baked that they have lasted for thousands of years. The bricks were laid in an interlocking pattern and that made the walls strong. In some cities, special buildings were constructed on the citadel. For example, in Mohenjo-daro, a very special tank, which archaeologists call the Great Bath, was built in this area. This was lined with the bricks, coated with plaster, and made watertight with a layer of natural tar. There were steps leading down to it from two sides, while there were rooms on all sides. Water has probably brought in from the well and drained out after use. Perhaps important people took a dip in this tank on special occasion. Other cities such as Kalibangan and Lothal had fire altars where sacrifices may have been performed, and some cities like Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, and Lothal had elaborate storehouses. Houses, drains, and streets. Generally, houses were either one or two-story high, with rooms built around a courtyard. Most houses had a separate bathing area, and some had wells to supply water. Many of these cities had covered drains. Notice how carefully these were laid down in straight lines, although you cannot see it. Each drain had a gentle slope so that water could flow through it. Very often, drains in houses were connected to those on the street and smaller drains led into the bigger ones. As the drains were covered, inspection holes were provided at the interval to clean them. All three houses, drains, and streets were probably planned and built at the same time. List at least two differences between the houses described here and those that you studied in Chapter 2. Life in the city. Life in the city. A Harappan city was a very busy place. There were peoples who planned the construction of special buildings in the city. These were probably the rulers. It is likely that the rulers sent people to distant lands to get metal, precious stones, and other things that they wanted. They may have kept the most valuable objects, such as the ornaments of the gold and silver, or beautiful beads, for themselves. And there were scribes, people who knew how to write, who helped prepare the seals and perhaps wrote on other materials that have not survived. Besides, there were men and women, craftspersons making all kinds of things, either in their own home or in special workshops. People were traveling to the distant lands or returning in with the raw material and perhaps stories. Many terracotta toys have been found and children must have played with these. Make a list of the people who lived in the city. Were any of these people listed as living in the village, such as Meherghar? New craft in the city. Let us look at some of the objects that were made and found in Harappan cities. Most of the things that have been found by archaeologists are made up of stones, shells, and metal, including copper, bronze, gold, and silver. Copper and bronze were used to make tools, weapons, ornaments, and vessels. Gold and silver were used to make the ornaments and vessels. Perhaps most of the striking finds are those of the beads, weights, and blades. The Harappans also made seals out of stones. These are generally rectangular and usually have an animal carved on them. The Harappans also made pots with beautiful black designs, such as one shown in page number 6. Shown on page number 6. Was metal used in the villages you learned about in chapter 2? Was stones used to make weights? Cotton was probably grown at Mehergarh from about 7,000 years ago. Actual pieces of clothes were found attached to the lid of the silver vase and some copper objects at Mohenjo-daro. Archaeologists have also found the spindle rolls made up of terracotta and faience. These were used to spin threads. Many of the things that were produced were probably the work of specialists. A specialist is a person who is trained to do only one kind of a work. For example, cutting of stone, cutting stones or polishing beads or carving seals. Look at the illustration and see how well the face is carved and how carefully the beard is shown. This must have been the work of expert craft person. Not everybody could have been a specialist. We do not know whether only men were specialists or only women were specialists. Perhaps some women and men may have been specialists. In search of raw material. Raw material are the substances that are either found naturally, such as the wood or ores of the metal, or produced by farmers or herders. These are then processed to produce the finished goods. For example, cotton, produced by the farmers as a raw material that may be processed to make cloth, while some of the raw material that Harappan used were available locally. Many items such as the copper, tin, gold, silver, and precious stones have had to be brought from the distant places. The Harappan probably got copper from the present-day Rajasthan and even from the Oman in the West Asia. Tin, which was mixed with copper to produce bronze, may have been brought from the present-day Afghanistan and Iran. Gold could have come all the way from the present-day Karnataka, and precious stones from the present-day Gujarat, Iran, and Afghanistan. Food for the people in the city. While many people lived in the city, other living in the countryside grew crop and reared animals. These farmers and herders supplied food to the craft person, scribes, and rulers in the cities. We know from the remains of the plant that Harappans grew wheat, barley, pulses, pea, rice, sesame, linseed, and mustard. A new tool, the plug, was used to dig the earth for turning the soil and planting seed, while real plugs, which were probably made up of wood, had not survived. Toy models have been found. As this region does not receive heavy rainfall, some form of irrigations may have been used. This means that the water was stored and supplied to the field when the plants were growing. The Harappans reared the cattle, sheep, goat, and buffalo. Water and the pastures are available around the settlements. However, in the dry summer months, larger herds of the animals were probably taken to the greater distance in search of the grass and the water. They also collected the fruits like burr, caught fish and hunted wild animals like antelope. A closer look, Harappan town in Gujarat. The city of Dholavira was located on Khadir Bait, also spelled as Bet, in the run of Kutch, where there was a fresh water and fertile soil. Unlike some of the other Harappan cities, which were divided into two parts, Dholavira was divided into three parts, and each part was surrounded with a massive stone wall with entrance through the gateways. There were also a large open area in the settlement where public ceremonies could be held. Other finds include large letters of the Harappan script that were carved out of the white stones and perhaps inlaid in the woods. This is a unique find as generally Harappan writing have been found on the small objects such as seals. The city of Lothal stood beside a tributary of Sabarmati in Gujarat, close to Gulf of Khambhat. It was situated near areas where raw materials such as semi-precious stones were easily available. This was an important center for making objects out of stones, shells, and metals. There was also a storehouse in the city. Many seals and sealings, the impression of the seals on the clay were found in the storehouse. A building that was found here was probably a workshop for making beads. Pieces of stones, half-made beads, tools for beads making, and finished beads have all been found here. Seals and sealings. Seals may have been used to stamp bags or packets containing goods that were sent from one place to another. After a bag was closed or tied, a layer of wet clay was applied on the knot and the seal was pressed on it. The impression of the seal is known as sealing. If the sealing was intact, one could be sure that the goods have arrived safely. Seals are used even today. Find out what they are used for. The mystery of the end. Around 3,900 years ago, we find the beginning of the major change. People stopped living in many other cities. Writing seals and weights were no longer used. Raw materials brought from the long distance became rare. In Mohenjo-daro, we find that garbage piled up on the streets. The drainage system broke down, and the new and less impressive houses were built, even over the street. Why did all this happen? We are not sure. Some scholars suggest that rivers dried up. Others suggest that there was deforestation. This could have happened because fuel was required for baking bricks and for smelting copper ores. Besides, grazing by large herds of cattle, sheep, and goats may have destroyed the green cover. In some areas, there were floods, but none of these reasons can explain the end of all city. Flooding or river drying up would have had an effect on only some areas It appears as if the ruler lost the control. In any case, the effect of the change are quite clear. Sites in Sindh and West Bengal, site in Sindh and West Punjab, present-day Pakistan, were abundant, while many people moved into newer, small settlements to the east and south. New cities emerged about 1400 years later. You will read about them in chapter 5 and 8 elsewhere. Find Egypt in your atlas. Most of the Egypt is a dry desert, except for the lands along the river Nile. Around 5,000 years ago, kings ruled over the Egypt. These kings sent armies to the distant lands to get gold, silver, ivory, timber, and precious stones. They also built huge domes known as pyramids. When they died, the bodies of kings were preserved and buried in these pyramids. These carefully preserved bodies are known as mummies. A large number of the objects were also buried with them. These include food and drink, clothes, ornaments, utensils, musical instruments, weapons, and animals. Sometimes even serving men and women were buried with rulers. These are amongst the most elaborate burials known in the world history. Do you think the kings would have needed these things after death? Thank you so much. Please like, share, and subscribe my channel. Thank you.